Rain had thinned to a cold mist by dawn, yet Diana Anderson stood drenched through as if she had walked the river itself. 2 hat boxes balanced against her hip and forearm, while the cords bit into the skin of her palms until each finger throbbed. The queue outside the Bath assembly rooms moved in polite inches. Carriages rolled forward, footmen leapt down, ladies stepped out under umbrellas the colour of cream and pearl. Diana did not have an umbrella. Her hem clung to her calves in heavy folds. Her shoes had taken in water on the walk from Camden Place, and each shift of her weight pressed wet leather against skin already rubbed raw. She swayed once when the larger box slipped. A gentleman beside her glanced, saw servant wool and patched cuffs, and looked away with the quick blankness of a man who had trained himself not to witness what did not flatter him. A woman behind him drew her daughter closer by the elbow, as if hunger and cold could spread by touch. Diana tightened her grip and lifted the boxes higher. Her stomach cramped again. Lady Anderson had denied her bread at first light with a smile so smooth it had no edges, saying the household table could not afford waste while guests arrived in 1 hour and demanded fresh pastries. The square had once opened before Diana, like a stage she had believed was meant to receive her. She remembered crossing these stones in kid slippers, her father's arm warm through his coat sleeve, the scent of tobacco and sea salt that clung to him no matter how often he changed his cravat. Men had stepped aside then. Women had nodded with measured courtesy. Mr. Anderson had imported timber and Baltic flax, and in those years his name carried weight in bathrooms where weight was currency. Then fever found him on a crossing near Lisbon, and he returned in a cedar coffin and unpaid whispers. The year after his burial, her father's second wife took command of accounts, keys, and conversation, and Diana learned how quickly memory could be edited when money faltered. Her pianoforte lessons were dismissed as vanity. Her French tutor was sent away at noon with half wages. A jeweller arrived, left with her mother's bracelets, and bowed lower to Lady Anderson than he had ever bowed to her father's child. By the time Diana turned 22, the chamber that had faced the garden had been given to a guest. Her own trunks moved to the attic under slanted tiles, and every favour done for her was spoken aloud as debt. Plain, Lady Anderson called her, graceless, expensive. The words were delivered in drawing-rooms where Diana stood with a tray and lowered eyes, as if she were not the subject but merely the furniture that held the cups. The line advanced by 3 steps. A porter barked for the names of subscribers. 2 young men laughed at something private and bright, then fell quiet when they noticed Diana listening by accident. She fixed her gaze on the carved lintel above the assembly room's entrance and breathed through another hollow wave in her belly. Hunger sharpened the world with a cruel precision. She smelled butter from the kitchens below stairs, though the doors were shut. She smelled lamp oil, damp wool, polished wood, and the faint powder on the neck of the lady directly ahead. Her wrists ached from carrying what should have ridden in the hands of hired men. Her right sleeve had frayed where Lady Anderson had seized it at departure, and turned her toward the street with a warning spoken near her ear, soft enough that no neighbour could call it cruelty. Stand straight. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not let them think I keep slatterns. Diana had stood straight. She had carried 6 parcels from house to carriage, then 2 from carriage to queue when the footman was redirected to escort Miss Clarissa and Miss Henrietta through a side entrance to avoid rain. The sisters were both younger and both perfumed with rosewater. They had not looked at her when she handed up their wraps. Clarissa had only said, "Mind the green silk, Diana. You always crush hems." And Henrietta had laughed with a hand over her teeth, not because the remark was witty, but because cruelty in chorus counted as family harmony in the Anderson household. By the last week of September, the mornings had turned iron grey before sunrise, and the cold in Diana's attic remained in her bones long after noon. She slept under one thin blanket and a retired curtain she had hemmed into a second covering. She woke with numb fingertips and breathed into them to coax motion back before she lit her candle stub. At night, when the house settled and footsteps ceased below, she drew out a small notebook from beneath the loose board near her bedstead and copied columns from old ledgers she had rescued from the rubbish basket in the late study. Figures, names, receipts, transfers. Then legal phrases she had memorized from damaged handbooks left by her father's clerk. Entail, minority, testamentary trust, guardian's duty, misappropriation. Her hand cramped around the pen. Ink stained her nail beds black. She kept writing. Lady Anderson believed deprivation would dull her. It had not. It had narrowed Diana's life to labour and calculation had become its own kind of prayer. If she understood the arithmetic, she told herself in the hard stillness of midnight, she might one day name the theft in words no one could dismiss as a girl's bitterness. She might one day stand in a room and say exactly where the money had gone, and to whom, and under what false signatures. Until that day she mended cuffs, carried parcels, trimmed lamps, and accepted that even pity had become a luxury item in circles that measured virtue by fabric weight. "Move, girl!" The command came from a senior doorkeeper in brass buttons, not unkind, merely practised. Diana shifted forward and nearly stumbled when her right shoe caught on a broken seam at the sole. She recovered without dropping the boxes. No one applauded steadiness in servants. Inside the vestibule the air was warmer, though not warm enough to release the chill in her knuckles. Marble reflected grey light from high windows. The floor had been freshly waxed, and she saw her own blurred shape in it, dark hair pinned too tightly, pale face drawn thin at the temples, mouth pressed into a line that looked severe until one noticed it was only restraint. A maid she recognised from another household passed with folded napery and gave the smallest glance of sympathy before lowering her eyes. The glance nearly undid her. Sympathy in that place felt more dangerous than open scorn because it reminded her she still possessed the capacity to be hurt by kindness withheld. She set the hat boxes where instructed. She was handed 2 more. Then a crate of folded table linen. Then a stack of programmes tied with blue ribbon that cut into the crease between thumb and forefinger. Names were called above her head. Laughing voices poured down from the gallery. A violin tested a scale in the ballroom and stopped mid-note. Diana moved from corridor to service passage and back again, carrying what was given, placing it where pointed, as if her body were a hinge the building used, without ever admitting the hinge existed. When she finally paused near the side table beneath a portrait of a former master of ceremonies, she pressed her fingertips against the edge to steady them and tried to swallow against a dry throat. She had not eaten since the heel of yesterday's loaf, taken cold in the scullery after midnight. Her pulse flickered at the base of her neck. Through the half-open door to the breakfast salon, she caught sight of Lady Anderson already installed among early patrons, silk sleeves whispering as she accepted greetings, her smile arranged to signal benevolence and breeding. Clarissa and Henrietta stood nearby in pale muslin, each one a polished reflection of the life Diana had been told she no longer deserved. Lady Anderson did not glance toward the service passage. She did not need to. Her control did not depend on watching every moment. It depended on Diana understanding that any mistake, however small, would be punished in private and denied in public. Diana lifted the next tray when asked, the metal bit cold against her burned palms. She walked toward the inner rooms while the rain began again against the high windows. Thin at first, then steadier, As if the morning had decided it had not yet finished with her, she crossed the threshold of the breakfast salon with the tray held level, though her wrists quivered under the silver. The room smelled of coffee, warmed cream, and orange peel set in small dishes beside crystal. Firelight touched the gilt frames and made the lady's jewels flash like hard frost. Lady Anderson sat nearest the mantel, rose silk arranged around her, as if the chair had been built for no other body, one gloved hand on the armrest, the other resting lightly on Clarissa's sleeve in a gesture that looked maternal from a distance and proprietary at close range. Henrietta laughed at something said by Mrs. Pembroke, and leaned back far enough to show the fine embroidery on her bodice. Diana recognised the thread. She had stitched it by lamplight 2 nights running, eyes burning, while Henrietta slept upstairs with a heated brick at her feet. Lady Anderson did not greet her. She never did in company. She only let her gaze travel from Diana's wet hem to her hands, and then away, the dismissal precise as a blade. "Set it there," she said, indicating a side table without looking, "and do not drip on the carpet. This is Itis Aubusson." Diana set the tray down exactly where indicated. One drop escaped from her sleeve and struck the polished wood. Clarissa saw it and smiled without warmth. "How tragic," she murmured. "The carpet survives, but only just." Diana took the soiled cups as soon as they were empty. She moved around chairs and skirts, listening because servants were expected to hear and forget, and because forgetting had become a luxury she could not afford. The morning subscriptions were discussed in voices pitched to suggest concern for the poor and confidence in Providence. Names were praised, contributions were hinted at and then announced. Lady Anderson let others speak first, then produced a folded list from her reticule and said, with practised modesty, that the Anderson household had always considered charity a sacred duty, especially in difficult seasons when bread prices climbed and respectable widows were at risk of unseemly dependence. The women around her approved in a soft chorus. Diana kept her face still while she stacked saucers. She knew where that money had gone. She had copied the figures by candle stub in an attic that smelled of damp slate and old wool. Donations marked for the Widows' Fund had been transferred twice in the household ledger, once to settle milliner accounts for Clarissa, once to a coachmaker in Bristol whose bill had purchased a new lacquered phaeton Lady Anderson called a necessity for visiting obligations. The first time Diana had seen the entries she thought she had misread them. She checked the column sums 3 times. She checked dates against household receipts. She checked signatures, same hand, same flourish on the final S. No error, only diversion. Lady Anderson lifted her cup and said, "My late husband valued benevolence above profit." The words were met with nods. Diana's fingers tightened around the tray edge until the knuckles whitened. When she turned toward the service door, Mrs. Ainsley from Marlborough Buildings caught her by the wrist, lightly, with 2 fingers and a ring that pressed cold against bruised skin. "You are Mr. Anderson's daughter, are you not?" she asked, as if requesting another spoon. The question was not kind. It was curiosity sharpened into social sport. Diana inclined her head, because silence would be read as insolence. "I am his daughter, ma'am." Mrs. Ainsley's painted mouth curved. Such a pity. He was handsome in his day. Commerce can lift families quickly and drop them quicker. Lady Anderson intervened before Diana could be asked another question. "My stepdaughter has a dramatic attachment to old titles," she said, with a soft laugh that invited others to laugh with her. "We indulge it when she is useful. She has not had the education to distinguish inheritance from sentiment." Clarissa lowered her lashes and added, "Papa tried so hard, but she was never inclined to refinement." Henrietta tapped her spoon against porcelain. She always preferred ledgers to lace. That earned a brighter ripple of laughter. Diana kept her eyes on the sugar bowl. Her father had taught her sums at 11 by drawing columns on scrap invoices and pretending each correct answer meant one more ship safely in port. He had kissed her forehead when she caught his intentional mistakes. She heard his voice now beneath the ladies' voices, roughened by sea wind, proud and careless, and alive. The memory struck so sharply that her throat tightened. She swallowed it down with the taste of coffee grounds and ash from the fire. The dead were never allowed to stay whole in this house. Lady Anderson remade them to suit the present room. Mr. Anderson became generous when generosity raised subscriptions. He became imprudent when debts were discussed. He became tender when guests admired family affection. He became foolish when Diana's claims were mentioned. Diana had learned the pattern 2 years after his burial, when she was called into the green drawing-room to witness an accounting she was not meant to understand. Lady Anderson sat behind his old writing desk, keys at her waist, while Mr. Pike, the solicitor, stood with his hat in his hands and a fixed expression that suggested long practice in regret. "The estate is strained," Lady Anderson had said. "Creditors require settlement. We must preserve what can be preserved for the younger girls." Diana had looked from one face to the other and asked where her mother's dowry trust had gone. Mr. Pike coughed. Lady Anderson answered before he could. "Into this family's survival. Where else? You eat our bread." Diana had said she would work. She would dismiss the governess. She would let the carriage go. She would sell her own jewels first. Lady Anderson smiled with that smooth, bloodless patience she reserved for moments of conquest. "Your jewels are already gone. The appraiser came last week. You were upstairs with your books." By evening the pianoforte had been listed. By morning the tutor had been discharged. By winter her room was reassigned to a visiting cousin, and a maid carried her trunks to the attic where rain hissed through cracked slate whenever the wind shifted west. "Diana!" Lady Anderson's voice snapped her back to the breakfast salon. "Attend!" She stepped forward at once. Lady Anderson did not raise her volume. She did not need to. "My fan!" Diana retrieved it from the sideboard and placed it in her stepmother's palm. The fan closed with a sharp click. Lady Anderson spoke through a smile meant for the room. "When Mr. Pike calls this afternoon, you will remain below stairs. You will not interrupt with fantasies about accounts. Do you understand me?" Diana answered, "Yes, Lady Anderson." Clarissa turned in her chair to inspect Diana as one inspects a seam. "And wear the brown dress, not that grey one with the mended collar. It offends the eye." Henrietta laughed softly. "The brown one is too short now." Lady Anderson's gaze flicked to Diana's ankles, then away. "Then keep to the passages where no one of consequence will see." Mrs. Pembroke said, "You are strict, Lady Anderson." Lady Anderson gave a graceful shrug. "Discipline is mercy when one shoulders another woman's child." She came to me wild with grief and no habits fit for society. "I have done what duty required." Diana felt heat rise under her skin despite the wet chill in her clothes. Wild with grief. She had been 15. Her father had been buried 2 days. She had stood at the churchyard gate with mud on her hem and dirt beneath her nails because she had refused to leave until the gravediggers stopped. Lady Anderson had drawn her into the carriage then, not with comfort but with calculation, and said, "Do not force me to choose between kindness and order." Kindness had not appeared again. A footman entered with a ledger bound in cracked red leather and set it by Lady Anderson's elbow. Diana recognised it at once. Household Disbursements, Q2 through Q4, the volume with the overwritten entries on pages 40 and 61. She had copied both pages in full and hidden the copy under the loose board beside her notebook. Lady Anderson rested her hand on the ledger as if it were an ornament. "Mrs. Pembroke, you asked how we maintain generosity while commerce declines. One must keep exact records. Waste ruins families." Her eyes lifted to Diana for a fraction of a second. A warning, a promise. Diana lowered her gaze and reached for the empty plates, but she could feel the pulse in her abraded palm, a hot beat against skin tightened by cold. She remembered the night she first found page 61. The house had been silent. Even the kitchen fire was banked low. She took the ledger from the study shelf, carried it to the attic under her shawl, and set it on the blanket at her knees, while rain struck the tiles in small, hard bursts. Column after column. Wheat, coal, soap, repairs. Then the line that made her stop breathing. Widow's Subscription Trust, transferred in full to Domestic Improvement account. No corresponding receipt. No witness signature. 2 weeks later, a milliner's invoice paid in the same amount. She wrote the figures until the ink blurred because her candle had burned low and her fingers shook from cold. She wrote them anyway. "Do not hover," Clarissa said as Diana collected her plate. "You stand like a reprimand." Diana moved back one pace. Clarissa leaned toward Henrietta and whispered just loud enough, "If Papa had lived, she would have married a clerk by now and vanished to Yorkshire. Providence had other ideas." Henrietta responded, "Who would have her? She looks half-starved." They both smiled into their cups. Lady Anderson heard and did not correct them. She only asked Diana, "Have the invitations for Thursday been sealed?" Diana answered, "Yes, Lady Anderson." "By hand?" "Yes, Lady Anderson." "With my signet?" "Yes." Lady Anderson's mouth flattened, not displeased, not pleased, merely measuring. "Then carry a replacement tray to the subscription library when the steward calls, and do not speak to gentlemen unless addressed." Diana dipped her head. Her palms were raw where the hat-box cords had cut them. Her wrists ached from carrying silver. Her stomach folded in on itself when the pastries were passed and none offered. Yet a hard strand of steadiness remained, stretched thin but unbroken. She had numbers now, dates, transfer paths, duplicate signatures on donor lists copied in the same hand with altered flourish to imitate age. Mr. Pike had looked away when she asked questions, but his look away had been answer enough. The debt was real. So was the theft. She had spent 6 months teaching herself the language men used to close doors in women's faces. Guardian's duty, fiduciary breach, beneficiary rights during minority. She could not yet force a court to listen. She could learn the exact sentence that would make refusal costly. In the breakfast salon, while porcelain clicked and polite voices rose and fell, her mind flashed to the first days of October at Camden Place, when every room had smelled faintly of lavender and sealing wax because Lady Anderson was preparing for the charity season. Preparation had meant Diana rose in darkness to polish, copy, carry, and absorb insult until her skin felt one size too small. She counted days by candle stubs. She counted bruises by colour. She counted coin figures in her head while she mended hems at midnight. The counting kept her from splintering. It also kept her dangerous in a way no one in that house had measured correctly. They believed deprivation would make her grateful for crumbs. It had made her precise. It had made her patient. It had taught her to hold a room's temperature, its alliances, its lies, the way a navigator held stars. In the breakfast salon, the fire snapped once, sharply, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the grate before the drawer corrected. No one but servants noticed. Diana noticed because she noticed all hazards now, visible and hidden, flame and ledger alike. She lifted the tray again when summoned. The metal chilled the raw skin along her palms. Lady Anderson was saying to Mrs. Pembroke, "One must be vigilant. Even inside one's own family, sentiment can become theft." Diana passed behind her stepmother's chair with her face composed, hearing each word land, storing each one where it could be used, and walked toward the inner corridor where service doors opened and closed like quiet verdicts. She walked toward the inner corridor where service doors opened and closed like quiet verdicts, and the verdict found her in less than 10 steps. A crash rang behind her, sharp and bright as a pistol shot. Crystal struck stone. Voices rose at once, then cut off into that stunned hush reserved for ruined objects and social danger. Diana turned. A flute stem spun across the threshold and hit her shoe. A shard skipped up and sliced her wrist just above the cuff. She drew breath through her teeth as pain flared clean and hot. Blood welled fast, startling against skin blanched by cold. Lady Anderson appeared in the breakfast salon doorway. Fan snapped shut in one hand, expression fixed in public concern and private fury. "Diana! Here, now!" The command travelled across marble and drew glances from every nearby table. Diana stepped back at once, tray still in her hands, while a steward hurried from the opposite passage with a fresh salver loaded in haste, coffee pot, cups, sugar bowl, cream jug, and a folded subscriber list weighted by a silver spoon. "Take this to the subscription library," Lady Anderson said, not lowering her voice. "At once! The Earl of Wrexham has arrived for the audit, and Mrs. Dalloway has no coffee before she begins to faint for attention." The name struck through Diana like a winter draught through cracked glass. Wrexham! Men in Camden Place kitchens said it softly, with admiration edged by fear. Men in counting houses said it with dislike sharpened by dependence. He bought failing notes and called debts precisely when pity would have been cheaper. He was said to read ledgers himself and remember every figure he touched. Lady Anderson's gaze dropped to Diana's bleeding wrist, then rose again with cool disdain. "Do not stain the list. If you ruin this morning, you will answer for it." Clarissa had moved to the doorway behind her mother, silk rustling, eyes bright with the prospect of spectacle. Henrietta tilted her head and smiled with small cruelty. "Try not to tremble in front of him, Diana. Great men dislike moisture." A footman offered no cloth. No one did. Diana shifted the tray to her left forearm and pressed her right thumb hard against the cut to slow the blood. The metal burned cold through her sleeve. Her hands were already raw from cords, soap, polish, and rain. Now they shook in thin, involuntary pulses that travelled from tendon to elbow. She set her jaw and kept the tray level. It was still not yet 9, and she had lived 3 mornings inside one. She moved when told, because standing still under Lady Anderson's stare would draw another command, louder, and she could not afford noise. The corridor narrowed. Service maids flattened themselves against panelled walls to let her pass. From the library end came the low murmur of titled voices and the dry rustle of paper turned by impatient hands. At the turn by the map room, she paused one heartbeat to wipe blood on the inner seam of her skirt, where no guest would see, then lifted the tray again and pushed through the double doors the steward had left ajar, carrying coffee, figures, and a wound she had no permission to bind. The subscription library held warmth without comfort. Coal burned in 2 grates, yet the room felt colder than the corridor because every chair was occupied by rank, and every rank was armed with appraisal. And tall windows admitted a thin washed light that turned dust into silver threads above the central table. Shelves of calf-bound volumes climbed the walls. The long mahogany surface had been cleared for ledgers, lists, and donation books tied with ribbon. Mrs. Pembroke sat near the hearth with 3 other matrons. feathers trembling at their hats as they whispered over names. Mr. Pike stood by the end of the table with his hat under his arm and his mouth drawn narrow, as if he had swallowed a bitter draught and could not risk tasting it again. Beside him, in plain dark coat and immaculate cravat, stood the magistrate for the district, summoned under the polite fiction of oversight, and now very much awake to the room's temperature. At the centre, one hand resting on an open ledger, was the Earl of Wrexham. He was taller than rumour made him, and broader through the shoulders, built like a man who had learned discipline in harsher places than bath parlours. His hair was dark and cut with military economy. His jaw held stillness the way stone holds winter. He wore gloves of black kid, though his right hand was bare where it touched the page, a pale scar crossing from thumb base to wrist, as if fire had once taught it a lesson and failed to erase it. His eyes lifted as Diana entered. They were not soft, they were not cruel, they were exact. She lowered the tray to the sideboard near the table and began to pour. Coffee struck porcelain in steady streams she had practised until silence covered the sound. She kept her head bowed. She could feel Lady Anderson behind her now, arriving with the rustle of rose silk and the scent of lavender water she reserved for public virtue. "My lord," Lady Anderson said, voice threaded with gracious surprise, "your visit honours our little effort beyond measure." Wrexham did not bow. "Your figures invited inspection." He turned one page with his bare right hand, then looked to the magistrate. "We proceed with witness present." The magistrate inclined his head once. Mr. Pike's fingers tightened on his hat brim. Diana poured for Mrs. Pembroke, then Mrs. Dalloway, then the magistrate, then Mr. Pike, and finally set a cup near the Earl's right elbow without meeting his eyes. Her wrist throbbed with each tilt of the pot. By the fourth cup, blood had begun to trace the edge of her cuff and darken the worn thread. Lady Anderson saw it and smiled as though nothing had happened. "She is clumsy with glass," she said lightly to the nearest matron. "One cannot mend temperament," Clarissa answered from behind a fan, "or bone structure." Henrietta's laugh fluttered and died when the Earl looked up. He did not look at the sisters first. He looked at Diana's hand. "Stop!" The word was quiet. It halted the room more cleanly than any shout. Diana froze with the coffee pot, half raised. Heat from the vessel pressed into her palm. A drop slid over the spout and struck the tray with a metallic tick that seemed loud enough to expose her heartbeat. Lady Anderson spoke quickly. "My lord, forgive the interruption. She will be removed." Wrexham did not turn toward her. His gaze remained on Diana's wrist. "Set it down." Diana obeyed. The pot touched silver. Her fingers released by effort, not relief. "Come here," he said. Every instinct sharpened against the command. Servants were summoned. Gentlewomen were invited. Daughters of dead merchants who served trays occupied no category that survived intact under this kind of attention. Yet refusal would be read as defiance, and defiance in this room would be paid for in private later. She stepped forward one pace, then another, and stopped at the table's corner. She kept her eyes lowered to the ledger edge where ink lines marched in tidy columns. "You are bleeding," he said. "It is nothing, my lord." "Liar!" The word landed without heat. It carried the weight of observation, not insult. Conversation around the room had thinned to breath and fabric. Diana could feel the matrons watching over cup rims, calculating scandal against entertainment. Lady Anderson moved closer, fan opening and shutting once, with a dry snap. "A trifling cut," she said. "She has poor habits with care." Wrexham held out his gloved left hand, palm up, not to Lady Anderson, to Diana. "Your hand!" Her skin prickled from wrist to throat. To place her hand in his was itself a breach. To refuse would mark her. She gave him the injured one because he had already seen it, and there was no concealment left to claim. He took her wrist lightly. Then, as if deciding something in full view of every eye in the room, caught the edge of his left glove with his teeth, drew it free finger by finger, and set it on the open ledger beside his bare right hand. The gesture was deliberate, intimate in a way no one could mistake. Leather whispered against paper. A chair creaked. Mrs. Dalloway made a soft sound and silenced herself. Wrexham's ungloved fingers touched Diana's palm. Not a caress, not possession. Examination. Warmth met cold skin. He turned her hand toward the window light with careful pressure at the heel of her thumb, exposing the cut line and the deeper abrasions beneath. Rope burns crossing old soap cracks and fresh glass, nicking through both. His thumb paused near a bruise darkening above her cuff, the shape of a grip not made by accident. He looked at it, then at her face. Her pulse struck against his fingers so hard she thought he must feel each beat as accusation. "How long has this been untreated?" he asked. She answered the only answer permitted. "I did not wish to delay service, my lord." Mrs. Pembroke shifted in her chair. "Devotion in staff is rare these days." Wrexham did not glance her way. "This is not devotion. This is neglect." He released Diana's hand only long enough to take a folded linen handkerchief from his coat pocket. Plain white. Initials stitched in dark thread. He wrapped it around her wrist with efficient turns, firm enough to close the bleed, gentle enough not to reopen it. Lady Anderson's fan stopped moving. "My lord," she said, each syllable polished, "you are kind, but she is accustomed to rough work. We cannot have every kitchen nick interrupting business." He tied the linen and lifted his gaze to her at last. "Then stop causing the nicks." The line struck the room like cold water. Clarissa flushed. Henrietta looked down at her cup. Mr. Pike stared fixedly at the far shelf as if legal philosophy and calfskin had become urgent. The magistrate's brows moved one fraction upward, then settled. Lady Anderson's smile returned by force, brighter and thinner. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding. Diana is often dramatic when corrected." Diana stood between them, with the handkerchief warm where his hand had been, her breath shallow. Shame and fury tangled so tightly she could not separate one from the other. She wanted to pull her wrist back and hide it in her sleeve. She wanted to ask why a stranger had done in 10 seconds what her own household had not done in 7 years. She did neither. She kept still, because stillness was survival. Wrexham looked down at the ledger again, then at the subscriber list weighted under the spoon on Diana's tray. "Who copied this list?" he asked. Lady Anderson answered at once. "My clerk prepared it from donor cards." His bare right hand tapped a line midway down the page. "The same donor appears twice with variant flourish on the surname. Same ink, same hand, different dates." He tapped a second line. "And this widow's mark is copied, not signed. The pressure pattern is identical to the entry above it." He turned to Mr. Pike. "You reviewed this?" Mr. Pike swallowed. "I reviewed summaries, my lord." "Then review originals now." Diana could not stop herself. "Page 61 in the Household Disbursement volume, my lord. Quarter 3 transfer. Widow's Trust to Domestic Improvement. No witness signature." The words left her mouth clean and clipped, the result of months of midnight rehearsal. Silence followed, thick and dangerous. Lady Anderson's head snapped toward her. "You will hold your tongue." Wrexham's gaze shifted back to Diana, sharpened by surprise rather than displeasure. "You have seen the ledger?" "Yes, my lord." "Why?" "Because the sums did not balance." A pause, long enough for the fire to settle in the grate with a low sigh. Lady Anderson stepped forward, silk whispering like threat. "She steals papers. She invents grievances. She has always confused arithmetic with entitlement. Wrexham took his glove from the ledger, but did not put it back on. He looked at the magistrate. "Seal the books, all of them." Then to Diana, his voice lower, each word unmistakable. "Do not leave this room." She stood where he had placed her, with his command and his linen at her wrist, the whole assembly watching the place his ungloved hand had touched, as if the skin itself had begun to speak. The magistrate moved first. He signalled to his clerk, who stepped to the side table with sealing wax and cord, his face set in the impersonal calm of a man who had learned to carry other people's disgrace without flinching. Mr. Pike set his hat down and opened the nearest volume with fingers that failed once at the clasp. Lady Anderson did not move from Diana's side. Her smile remained fixed, but a pulse beat in her throat above the lace collar. "You exceed courtesy, my lord," she said, soft enough to imitate reason. "A household list may contain errors. That does not merit seizure in public." Wrexham's eyes stayed on the page. "Fraud merits witness." "Fraud is an ugly word. It is also a precise one." Clarissa shifted closer to her mother, fan held high to shield half her face. Henrietta kept looking at Diana's bandaged wrist as if the cloth itself were an affront. Mrs. Pembroke leaned toward Mrs. Dalloway and whispered something that made both women sit straighter, eager and appalled in equal measure. The room had changed shape in a minute. It was no longer a salon. It was a ledger with people written into columns, each waiting to see on which side of the line they would be totalled. Lady Anderson let her fan open and close once, the ribs clicking like small bones. "Diana has always had a lively imagination. She reads scraps and builds accusations from dust. Ask her where she learned legal terms. In an attic, from rubbish. She mistakes copying for comprehension." Diana kept her gaze on the table edge, then lifted it to the magistrate, not to her stepmother. "Sir, if I am wrong, the pages will prove it. If I am right, the pages will prove that also." The magistrate watched her for a long beat. "Did anyone instruct you to make this statement?" "No, sir." "Did the Earl direct your claim?" "No, sir." Lady Anderson gave a brief laugh. "You see, the girl rehearses martyrdom. She has done so since childhood." Wrexham turned a second ledger toward the light. "Childhood ended when you spent trust money on carriage lacquer." The words landed without raised voice. Clarissa inhaled sharply. Henrietta looked toward the door as if considering flight and remembering that departure could look like admission. Mr. Pike cleared his throat. "My lord, if we proceed methodically, we may avoid unnecessary scandal." Wrexham did not look up. "Method is what created this room." Outside the high windows the rain thickened, a fine grey sheet that blurred the square into watercolour. The fire in the near grate sank, then flared when a draught crossed the chimney. Smoke trailed briefly along the mantel and vanished. Diana noticed the shift because she noticed every shift now, the scent turning sharp, the hiss in the flue, the way one curtain edge lifted and settled. She did not move. She had been told to remain. Obedience had become a strategy rather than a virtue, and strategies could be revised only when timing allowed. The clerk tied cord around the first stack of books and dripped wax at the knot. His seal pressed down with a dull click. One by one, volumes that had governed years of quiet theft were transformed into evidence. Lady Anderson stepped nearer Diana until silk brushed wool. Her voice dropped to a murmur that no one else could hear. "Say you were mistaken. Say you read the wrong column. Do it now, and I may still keep you in the house." Diana did not turn her head. "You kept me in the house already." The fan's edge touched her elbow, not hard enough to be seen as a strike, hard enough to sting. "Ungrateful child." Not a child!" For one instant rage cracked Lady Anderson's polished expression. It vanished at once as Mrs. Pembroke looked over. Lady Anderson lifted her chin and addressed the room. "This is what charity earns. One rescues an orphaned girl from ruin, and she repays care with slander," Diana answered before fear could close her throat. "You did not rescue me. You inherited me." Mr. Pike shut his eyes briefly. The magistrate's clerk paused with the seal mid-air, then resumed as if he had heard nothing at all. From the far corridor came the patter of small boots and a boy's breathless call. "Uncle Ashford! Uncle!" The door opened wider. A child of 8 or 9 crossed the threshold in navy velvet, fair hair untidy from haste, a wooden horse clutched by one wheel in his fist. His face had the pale, pinched look of a child recently ill, and his eyes fixed at once on the Earl with the urgent trust children gave only to one person in a room. "Edmund?" Wrexham's tone did not warm, yet his shoulders altered, tension shifting direction. "You were told to remain with nurse." "I did. Then she slept in the chair. I came quietly." The boy glanced around and faltered as he registered the crowded room. "Am I in trouble?" "You are in a place you should not be." Mrs. Dalloway made a sympathetic coo. Clarissa whispered to Henrietta, "How theatrical!" Diana felt anger rise at the word because the boy's mouth had tightened in immediate shame and he stood very still, braced for rebuke. The near chimney gave another low cough. A downdraft pushed a scatter of sparks from the grate, mouth onto the stone lip. Most died at once. One landed on the tassel fringe of the nearest curtain and glowed red. Another dropped into a basket of folded music sheets set beside the pianoforte. A thin tongue of smoke began to climb. A footman saw it and hesitated, eyes darting from flame to ladies' skirts, calculating blame. Mrs. Pembroke half rose, then sat again to save her gown from ash. Lady Anderson took one step backward from the hearth and drew Clarissa with her. Henrietta squealed and covered her face. The boy turned toward the smoke, startled, and his breath hitched into a cough. Diana moved. She stripped her shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it around the music basket in one hard sweep, pressing down with both palms against stone to choke the ember before it could find paper. Heat bit through wool into already broken skin. She set her jaw and held pressure until the smoke thinned. With her free hand she caught the curtain tassel and smothered the glow against the hearth edge. A spark burned through one corner of the shawl and died. "Water," she said to the frozen footman. "A small bucket, now!" He ran. Edmund coughed again, shorter this time, and backed into the table leg with a frightened sound. Diana dropped to one knee beside him, keeping her body between the child and the hearth. "Look at me," she said quietly. "The fire is out." His lower lip trembled. "I do not like the noise." "I know." She lowered her voice further, the cadence turning instinctive, old as deck planks and winter crossings. "Breathe with me, slow, in, hold, out." He tried and failed on the first breath. She did not correct him sharply. She placed her uninjured hand flat over her own ribs so he could mirror the motion. Again, in, hold, out. On the second attempt, his shoulders dropped a fraction. On the third, the cough loosened into air. The room had gone silent, except for rain and the faint crackle of settling coals. Behind her, Lady Anderson recovered her voice first. "Diana, stand away from him! You will frighten the child." Edmund clutched Diana's burned shawl corner and shook his head without looking at Lady Anderson. "No!" The word was thin but clear. Wrexham had moved from the table during the smoke, but she had not seen when. She sensed him only when his shadow cut across the hearthstone. He was close enough that she could feel cold rain on his coat. As if he had passed near an open door moments earlier, she kept her attention on the boy. "Does your chest hurt?" she asked Edmund. "A little. Any sharp pain?" He shook his head. "Good. Then we keep breathing slow." From somewhere deep in memory, the sailor's lullaby surfaced. Her father had used it in storms when masts groaned and men swore under their breath, not to make fear vanish, only to give it a rhythm smaller than panic. Diana hummed 2 measures, low and even. Edmund's fingers tightened on the shawl, then eased. His lashes lowered. He followed the cadence like a rope in dark water. The footman returned with a bucket. Diana took it, dampened a cloth, and handed it up without turning. "Douse the grate, lip, and curtain hem only. Do not flood the carpet." The footman obeyed instantly, grateful for instruction that freed him from choosing. By the time the magistrate's clerk moved the music basket aside, the smoke was gone. The scorched wool smell remained, sharp and stubborn. Diana looked down at her palms. Fresh redness flared across the right hand where the linen had shifted. The left had taken the worst of the heat beneath the shawl fold. Pain pulsed in rising waves. She ignored it and asked Edmund, "Can you stand?" He nodded. She rose with him, one hand at his shoulder, and guided him to the chair nearest the window where the air was clearer. She did not release him until his breathing steadied fully. Only then did she realize Wrexham had said nothing. She looked up and found his gaze fixed on her hands. He did not reach for her. He turned to the boy first. "Edmund!" The child looked up at once. "You will return to nurse after this." "Yes, uncle." Wrexham inclined his head once, acceptance and command in the same movement. Then he faced the room. "No one leaves." Lady Anderson spread her hands in offended grace. "My lord, surely this interruption proves only that household staff are prone to dramatics. She created disorder, then performed rescue." Diana could not believe the words, and yet believed them completely, because this was the logic by which she had lived for years. Injury blamed on the injured, labour called vanity, survival called theatre. Before she could speak, Edmund did. He sat small and straight in the chair, wooden horse in his lap, face still pale. "She saved my horse from the spark," he said, voice wavering only once, "and me from coughing." No one answered. Wrexham crossed to the scorched basket, lifted the top folio, and exposed the blackened corner where ember had bitten through. He held it up for the magistrate. "Record this as incident during audit. Note response by Miss Anderson." The magistrate nodded to his clerk, who wrote quickly. Lady Anderson's fan trembled. "You mean to put a servant's name in official minutes?" Wrexham set the folio down with care. "I mean to put facts where they cannot be edited." Diana felt the sentence strike somewhere deeper than pride. Facts where they could not be edited. Her father had said almost those words once at his desk, laughing, teaching her why columns mattered. Ink was memory that could survive the storyteller. Mrs. Pembroke rose, fussing at her sleeve. "The child should have camphor. I have a vial." Diana answered before anyone else could turn him into an exhibit. "He needs quiet air and water, ma'am, not scent." Mrs. Pembroke stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" Wrexham spoke without looking at her. "You have it." That ended the matter. Within a quarter hour, the noon bell from St. Michael's carried faintly through the rain, and the library settled into a new order built from command rather than courtesy. The magistrate's clerk marked each seized ledger with date and witness initials. Mr. Pike produced keys he had hoped not to surrender and opened the locked dispatch box from Camden Place that Lady Anderson had insisted was private correspondence. It held receipts, donor cards, and 2 small account books bound in blue, both in Clarissa's hand. Clarissa wept without tears and said she had only copied what she was told. Henrietta denied knowledge and then contradicted herself within 3 questions. Through it all, Diana remained near the window beside Edmund until nurse arrived, breathless and mortified, to retrieve him. Before he left, the boy looked at Diana with solemn concentration and placed his wooden horse in her palm. "For luck," he whispered. She closed his fingers back around it. "Keep your own luck. You will need it for lessons." He gave the smallest nod and went, one hand in nurse's, shoulders no longer shaking. When the door shut behind him, pain came flooding in. Her burned left palm throbbed. The cut at her wrist had reopened under the shawl pressure. The skin at her thumb web felt stretched too tight. She tucked both hands into the folds of her skirts so no one would see them tremble. Wrexham noticed anyway. "Show me." She drew breath. "My lord, the audit! Show me!" She obeyed. He took one look and gestured to the footman. "Cold water, clean linen, salve from the surgery chest." Lady Anderson gave a brittle laugh. "Are we to halt legal inquiry for every blister?" Wrexham's face did not alter. "Legal inquiry includes witness capacity." He turned to Diana, voice lower. "Sit." She sat on the straight-backed chair by the side table because her knees had begun to weaken and pride could not hold bone upright forever. He rinsed her hands himself, movements economical, no softness performed for room approval. Water ran pink from the reopened cut. He cleaned ash from the burn with a precision that told her he had done this for worse wounds and on darker days. When she flinched, he paused, not withdrawing, only waiting until she steadied. "Does it hurt?" she asked before caution could stop her. His fingers tightened once around the linen strip. A scar at the base of his right thumb pulled pale against skin. "Yes," he said, "one word. No ornament." It was the first truthful answer to that question she had heard from a powerful person in years. He tied the bandage and released her. His hand hovered for a fraction over her knuckles, then withdrew as if he had remembered the room again. Around them paper rustled, wax cooled, pens scratched, reputations shifted their weight. Lady Anderson tried a final angle, voice honeyed with fatigue. "My lord, this can still be managed quietly. We are all friends here." Wrexham looked at the sealed stacks, then at the magistrate, then back to her. "No, you are parties." The magistrate closed the dispatch box and set his seal. "Lady Anderson, until review is complete, you will not remove records, transfer funds, or leave Bath without notice. Miss Anderson will provide a statement this afternoon." Lady Anderson's eyes cut to Diana, hatred now stripped of performance. "You would drag your own family into court." Diana rose slowly, both hands bandaged, shoulders squared despite the shake in her limbs. "You dragged widows into hunger. I am only naming the road." Silence fell again, but it had a different weight. Not scandal, recognition. Wrexham turned to the clerk. "Record that line exactly." The clerk, startled, dipped his pen and wrote. Ink scratched over paper in a thin, relentless line. Diana watched the nib move as if it were carving stone. Her own words looked smaller once they were written, smaller and far more dangerous. The magistrate sanded the page, blew lightly, and closed the minute book with his palm. Lady Anderson turned that soft, murderous smile toward the table nearest her. "We have all had a trying morning. Miss Anderson is overtired. She has always been given to dramatic language when fatigued." Diana kept her shoulders square. Her hands pulsed under the fresh bandages. The magistrate said, "Her statement will be taken while memory is immediate." "Then I shall attend," Lady Anderson replied. "She is my responsibility." Wrexham did not raise his voice. "No!" Lady Anderson's fan stopped mid-motion. "My lord, no party under review attends witness examination. She is not a witness. She is a dependent in my household." Wrexham turned one of the seized ledgers so the magistrate could see the inside cover. He tapped the inscription in faded ink. E. Anderson, Household Disbursements. "She is the beneficiary named in her father's papers. Your household is now the subject of inquiry. Distinctions matter." The magistrate inclined his head once. "They do." Lady Anderson stepped toward Diana and reached, perhaps to guide, perhaps to grip. Her fingers never landed. Wrexham moved between them with such spare efficiency that no chair scraped, no hem caught, no one could claim he had shoved her. He simply occupied the space first and made it unavailable. "Do not touch her." The words were level, without ornament, and they did not belong to private rebuke. They belonged to record. The room heard them and could not unhear them. Clarissa made a small sound behind her fan. Henrietta stared at the floor. Mr. Pike looked old enough to fold. Lady Anderson drew her hand back, colour rising under powder. "You mistake concern for aggression." Wrexham's eyes did not leave her face. "I do not mistake grip marks for concern." Diana felt the sentence travel through her like a struck bell. Grip marks. He had seen them in one glance and named them in front of witnesses, where denial would cost more than cruelty ever had. The magistrate cleared his throat. "Miss Anderson will give her statement in the map room. Clerk, prepare a second book. Mr. Pike, remain." Lady Anderson spread her hands again, all polished injury. "Then at least permit her to return home afterward. This spectacle has gone far enough." Wrexham answered before the magistrate could. "She will not return to Camden Place tonight." Silence snapped tight across the library. It was not merely a command, it was a boundary laid in public between Diana and the only roof she had known since her father's burial. And every person in that room understood what such a line meant when spoken by an earl before an officer of the court. Lady Anderson laughed once, brittle as dry glass. "By what authority do you place women in houses not their own?" "By the authority of keeping a witness uncoerced." The magistrate said, "That is prudent." Lady Anderson wheeled toward him. "Prudent? To lodge a young woman under a gentleman's arrangement. Bath will talk?" "Bath is already talking," the magistrate replied. "Bath may do so on facts for once." Diana had not moved. Her knees felt hollow and fiercely upright at once. Camden Place. Not tonight. The phrase should have brought relief cleanly, yet old training rose first. Where would she sleep? What debt would attach? What favour would be demanded for shelter given by powerful men? She knew too well that protection often arrived with hidden columns. Wrexham turned slightly, enough to include her in his line of sight. "You will be lodged with Mrs. Davies at Wrexham House, separate floor, female staff only. If you object, say so now." It took her a moment to answer because he had done something no one in authority had done in years. He had given terms and offered refusal in the same breath. "I do not object, my lord." "Good." He faced the magistrate again. "Record lodging terms exactly." The clerk's pen resumed, brisk now. Lady Anderson took one measured breath and changed strategy. Her voice warmed to maternal sorrow. "Diana, child, you do not understand how men use scandal. Come home. We shall settle this quietly." Diana met her eyes for the first time since the ledger was sealed. "Quietly has been expensive." A faint shift passed through Mrs. Pembroke's mouth. Not quite approval, not quite shock. Mr. Pike rubbed his brow and said nothing. The magistrate gathered the statement pages. "Miss Anderson, with me." Diana stepped, and pain lanced through her left palm where the burn had tightened. She did not hiss. She only steadied her breathing and followed toward the side door. Wrexham walked one pace behind and slightly to her right, close enough that she felt the weight of his presence, far enough to preserve formal distance. He did not speak to fill the corridor. The silence he kept was not neglect. It was guard. In the map room the fire had burned lower. Damp wool and sealing wax scented the air. A long table stood under a wall chart of shipping routes that looked, in the dim light, like veins over pale skin. The magistrate seated himself at one end. His clerk opened a fresh book. Mr. Pike stood near the mantel, reluctant and trapped. "State your name," the magistrate said. "Diana Eleanor Anderson." "Age, 22. Relation to Lady Anderson." "Stepdaughter." "Begin with the first discrepancy you personally observed." Diana drew breath and began. She gave dates, pages, amounts. She did not dramatise, she did not soften. She described the copied donor marks, the duplicated signatures with altered flourish, the trust transfer on page 61, the matching disbursement to the Bristol coachmaker, the milliner invoice entered 2 lines below with no corresponding household need. Each figure left her mouth steadier than the last, as if numbers were stones in a river, and she had crossed them in darkness too many nights to slip now. When she faltered over a date, Mr. Pike supplied it in a strained voice, then looked ashamed for helping, and more ashamed for not helping sooner. Twice Lady Anderson attempted to enter. Twice the footman barred the door with formal apologies and visible relief that he had clear instructions. The statement stretched. Outside, rain beat harder on the window panes, and then eased. By the time the clock on the landing struck 1, Diana's throat was dry, and her back ached from holding straight. Her bandages had darkened at the wrist. The magistrate noticed first. "We pause 5 minutes." "No," Diana said. "If I stop, I may lose sequence." Wrexham spoke from the wall, where he had stood almost motionless through the entire examination. "You will drink water." She turned toward him, startled by the edge in his tone. "My lord, I can continue." "You are shaking." She looked down. Her right hand trembled against the page margin. Small, involuntary movements she had not felt. "That does not alter the figures," she said. His mouth tightened. "Drink!" The single word carried command and something harder to bear, concern stripped of display. She took the cup the clerk offered and drank because refusal would waste strength she needed elsewhere. When the magistrate resumed, he asked, "How did you gain access to sealed household books?" "I was ordered to dust the study each Thursday. I copied entries at night and replaced volumes before dawn." "Why did you not petition earlier?" "Petitions require coin, witnesses, and leisure, sir." A brief pause. "Did anyone encourage you to build this record?" "No." "Did the Earl?" "No." "Had the Earl spoken to you before this morning?" Diana felt heat rise at her throat. "No, sir." The question hung in the room with all the implications it intended. Wrexham did not move. The stillness had become its own declaration. He had stood there through every answer, not correcting, not rescuing, not distancing himself from the risk of association. Powerful men usually stepped away from stain as soon as stain appeared. He had not taken one step back. The magistrate closed the second book. "Statement complete for now, Miss Anderson. You may append later details once documents are reviewed." Mr. Pike exhaled, as if he had been holding breath for years. When they returned to the library, the social theatre had thinned. Mrs. Pembroke and Mrs. Dalloway had withdrawn under pretexts of headaches. Clarissa sat rigid near the cold grate, her eyes swollen and dry. Henrietta clutched a handkerchief and would not look at Diana. Lady Anderson stood at the centre table as if still hosting, though the ledgers were gone and the candles had burned low. The magistrate addressed her directly. "Lady Anderson, preliminary order is now in effect. You are restricted from direct contact with Miss Anderson, except in counsel's presence. You are additionally prohibited from entering Camden Place, records room, without court officer." Lady Anderson's composure flickered. "You would place me under household arrest on a servant's allegations." "On documentary irregularities corroborated by your own solicitor." Mr. Pike lowered his eyes. Lady Anderson's gaze cut to Diana, then to Wrexham. "And where shall she be kept? In his guest wing like a foundling? You disgrace her more thoroughly than I ever could." The cruelty was deliberate and precise. It struck where social fear lived. Diana opened her mouth and closed it. Shame burned hot and useless in her chest, old reflex rising with brutal speed. Wrexham answered before silence could become assent. "She will be treated as Miss Anderson of Camden Place, daughter of Elias Anderson, beneficiary under review, steward designate for the Widow's Trust, pending court confirmation. Any person who speaks otherwise in my hearing will answer for defamation." He spoke each title as if entering it in a ledger. Not flattering, not tender. Official, real. Lady Anderson stared at him. "You would stake your name on hers?" His reply came without delay. "I already have." The room did not breathe for a full beat. Diana felt the floor tilt, then settle. He already had. Not in whispers, not in private, not with hand at her elbow in a dark corridor where words could be denied later, in front of a magistrate, a solicitor, witnesses, and the women who had watched her carry trays like furniture with a heartbeat. He had attached his rank to her credibility. If she fell now, she would pull him into public embarrassment and legal nuisance. Men of his station avoided such entanglement as a rule of survival. He had broken the rule and spoken it aloud. The magistrate gathered his papers. "We are done here until morning review." Lady Anderson lifted her chin, every inch grande dame, despite the crack running through her authority. "This is not done." "No," Wrexham said. "It is recorded." A footman appeared at the door. "The carriage is ready, my lord." Wrexham looked to Diana. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Take my arm." She hesitated on instinct. Arms in public had meanings. Debt, possession, scandal, protection. He read the hesitation and altered nothing in his expression. "This is not for appearance," he said quietly. "The stairs are wet." She placed her bandaged fingers on his sleeve. Wool, rain-cold and solid. The contact sent a sharp current through her, not because of romance, not yet, but because her body had learned to brace for harm at every touch, and this touch asked nothing except balance. They crossed the library together. Clarissa looked away first. Henrietta stared at the floorboards, as if they might open. Lady Anderson watched with naked hatred and something new beneath it, calculation without certainty. At the threshold, Diana heard movement behind them and turned half a pace. Edmund stood in the corridor with nurse, clutching his wooden horse, eyes solemn. He saw her and raised the toy in a tiny salute. She gave the smallest nod she could manage without breaking composure. Nurse whisked him back before any rebuke could land. The staircase to the side entrance held tracked rain from boots and hems. Wrexham kept his pace matched to hers, never rushing, never asking whether she needed rest where servants might hear and repeat. On the second landing, her left hand spasmed under the bandage. She stopped for one breath. He did not pull. He simply waited, still as carved stone, until she said, "I can continue." At the porte-cochere, grey light flattened the square. The rain had become a fine, steady curtain. His carriage stood ready, horses stamping, coachman rigid on the box. Mrs. Davies, a broad-shouldered woman in dark bombazine with kind, guarded eyes, waited by the open door. "Miss Anderson," she said, with a small curtsy that acknowledged personhood rather than pity, "your room is prepared." Diana looked from Mrs. Davies to the carriage interior and then back to Wrexham. "My notebook remains in the attic at Camden Place. Describe it." "Brown cover, thumb-sized crack at the spine. Hidden beneath a loose board under the bedstead, right side." He nodded once. "It will be retrieved under warrant before dusk. You will identify it in my study." There was no flourish in the promise, only procedure. Yet it reached the one private place she had guarded for years. He held out his ungloved hand to assist her into the carriage. She placed her bandaged hand in it. His grip was careful, steady, unmistakably real. When she settled on the seat, he did not release at once. His thumb rested for a fraction against the linen at her wrist where blood had dried through the weave. "You will eat when you arrive," he said. "Yes, my lord." "You will sleep." She almost answered with habit, with apology, with assurances she did not owe. Instead, she said, "I will try." His eyes held hers, storm grey and unreadable except for one plain fact. He was staying until she was safely out of this square. "Do not try," he said. "Do it." Then he let go, closed the carriage door himself, and stood in the rain without moving as the horses pulled her away. The carriage wheels hissed over wet stone, and Diana sat rigid through every turn, hands wrapped in linen, the Earl's command still warm in her ear, as if the door had not yet closed between them. Wrexham House rose from the mist at the edge of Queen Square, all pale stone and narrow windows lit against rain, not ostentatious from the street, yet severe enough to warn idlers away. Mrs. Davies met her inside the service vestibule, with a shawl warmed at the kitchen grate, and a tray already waiting in the small morning room. Broth, bread, cold beef and tea strong enough to steady a fainting woman. Diana stared at the food for one suspended moment, shame and hunger wrestling like enemies who knew each other well. Mrs. Davies said very quietly, "No one will take this plate from you, miss." Diana sat. She ate too fast at first, then forced herself slower when her stomach cramped. By dusk, when the rain had thinned to a silver drift against the glass, a surgeon from Milsom Street had cleaned the burns, rebandaged both hands, and left instructions in a neat hand on folded paper that Mrs. Davies pinned above the washstand. Diana read the page twice, not because she doubted it, but because written care still felt foreign. At the 9th hour the Earl returned with the magistrate's clerk and a constable carrying a sealed satchel. They met in the study under 2 lamps and the scent of wet wool. The satchel seal was intact. The clerk read the warrant aloud, each clause clipped and formal, then set the parcel on the desk and cut the cord. Inside lay her brown notebook, spine cracked exactly as she had described, 2 copied sheets in her hand, one original ledger leaf from page 61 removed under court supervision because the binding had split, and a small packet of donor cards tied with blue thread. Diana's breath caught when she saw the notebook. Years of midnight arithmetic, hidden beneath a loose board, had crossed town under law instead of fear. "Identify each item for record," the clerk said. She did. The Earl watched without interrupting. When she reached for the notebook, he moved the inkstand aside so her bandages would not brush it, an ordinary practical gesture that still struck like tenderness. The clerk sanded his page and asked, "Do you submit this as evidence voluntarily?" Diana answered, "I do." The constable sealed the items again, leaving her only a certified copy of her own notes. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was mislaid. For the first time, every physical thing she had risked her sleep to preserve was where a court could not pretend it had never existed. By the second morning after the audit, the inquiry sat in the magistrate's chamber behind the Guildhall, where raincoats steamed by the door, and the benches smelled of damp oak. Lady Anderson arrived in grey silk and controlled outrage. Clarissa wore black ribbon at her throat, as if attending a funeral. Henrietta kept twisting her gloves until one seam split. Mr. Pike stood with a packet in his hands and looked as though he had aged 10 years in 10 days. When called, he stepped forward and produced a sealed codicil he admitted he had withheld after Mr. Anderson's death at Lady Anderson's instruction, telling himself delay was prudence while knowing it was cowardice. His voice shook once, then steadied. The codicil named Diana's mother's dowry as a protected trust, named Diana sole beneficiary at majority, and named misuse by any guardian a prosecutable breach. A low murmur ran through the room and stopped when the magistrate lifted his hand. Clarissa, pressed under oath, admitted she had copied signatures from prior lists because her mother said it was household efficiency. Henrietta confirmed she had carried duplicate cards to the printer and been told never to mention the second bundle. Mrs. Ainsley submitted a statement through counsel claiming no knowledge. The magistrate noted it and moved on. Her curiosity had never ripened into courage, and that, too, entered the aftermath as fact. When Diana gave her final testimony, she spoke from notes because her hands still ached when held too long in one position. She named each transfer path and each false heading. She described the chimney downdraft incident only when asked, and the footman's sworn account matched hers. Sparks, hesitation, response, no theatrics. The magistrate accepted the account into minutes, along with the surgeon's report on her burns and the clerk's chain of custody record for the notebook and ledgers. Lady Anderson attempted one last appeal to social ruin. "You would destroy your own family name," Diana answered. "I am preserving the only part of it that fed anyone." The magistrate issued orders before noon. Lady Anderson removed from control of all Anderson Trust assets, pending full civil action. Clarissa and Henrietta released to their maternal aunt under supervised allowance. Camden Place accounts frozen, and temporary stewardship of the Widow's Fund transferred to an independent board, chaired by Miss Diana Anderson, with Mr. Pike acting under bond and court review. Then, with the room listening, he added, "Miss Anderson is to reside where she chooses, free of household coercion." Lady Anderson stared at Diana with that old blade-bright hatred, opened her mouth and said nothing at all. The look paid off only in silence. She knew exactly what had been lost and could not rephrase it. That afternoon, in the same subscription library where she had been ordered to stand still and bleed politely, the Widows' Committee reconvened under official notice. The scorched corner of the music folio had been preserved in an evidence sleeve and now rested on the side table as a strange little emblem of the day pretence burned and did not spread. Mrs. Pembroke arrived subdued. Mrs. Dalloway did not faint. The Earl stood at the end of the long table and placed a draft beside the restored trust ledger. "Initial restitution from recovered Anderson accounts," he said, "matched personally by Wrexham Estate for immediate winter disbursement." He turned to Diana. "Read the beneficiary roll." Her throat tightened, yet her voice held as she read each widow's name and amount. When she finished, Mrs. Davies, serving tea at the wall, gave one brief nod that carried more approval than any speech. Funds moved that day, not promised for some airy future. Coal orders were signed. Bread vouchers were countersigned. The committee's old rhetoric of charity gave way to columns that balanced in plain sight. 3 days later, Edmund was brought to Wrexham House with nurse and a lecture already half forgotten. He paused in the doorway of the blue drawing-room, wooden horse tucked under his arm, and looked solemnly at Diana's bandaged hands. "I was told to thank you properly," he said, as if reciting from memory. She knelt despite the pull in her palms. "Then I am properly thanked." He considered this, then whispered, "Uncle does not sleep when people are hurt. Nurse says he walks the corridor." Diana looked up before she could stop herself. The Earl stood by the mantel, expression unchanged, scar pale at the base of his thumb. He did not deny it. He only said, "Edmund, your map lesson." The boy groaned and obeyed. When he had gone, the Earl crossed to the table where Diana had spread revised trust figures and stopped at the edge of candlelight. "You can remain here until judgment enters," he said. She looked at the columns, then at him. "And afterward?" "Where you choose." The answer was plain. No trap. No debt hidden behind velvet language. She set down her pen. "At the assembly rooms, you said you would give me your name when I asked." His jaw tightened once. "Yes." She felt her pulse rise, not from fear this time, but from the magnitude of being believed and then offered more without coercion. "Then I ask now," she said, "not for rescue, for partnership. I will not be managed again." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Good." It was the same word he had used like a blade in public, now altered by context into assent. "The settlements will protect your authority over your own funds and the trust," he added. "No clause without your consent, no signature taken in haste." "Then I agree." On a cold morning in December, with frost whitening the chapel steps and breath visible in the nave, they married before a small congregation. Mrs. Davies in deep bombazine, Edmund scrubbed and restless, Mr. Pike grave and newly careful, the magistrate as witness by invitation, and a handful of widows in borrowed shawls seated near the front because Diana had insisted the first disbursement recipients should stand where exclusion had once stood. Clarissa and Henrietta sent no message. Lady Anderson remained under civil restraint in Bristol, lodging pending final asset adjudication. She contested, lost, and was granted an annuity contingent on non-interference. The legal papers were signed, filed, and copied. Camden Place was sold to satisfy debts and replenish the trust principal. Nothing vanished between hearing and order. At the rail, when the vicar asked for hands, the Earl removed his glove before touching hers. The gesture no longer scandalised the room. It completed it. After the blessing, they did not flee into romance or spectacle. They walked together to the vestry table, where the register lay open and signed in full view, then crossed to the side ledger Diana had prepared for the widow's winter account, and entered the first married day transfer under her new name and her own hand. Ink dried. Sand fell. Mrs. Davies closed the book. Outside, church bells carried over frozen roofs, while the poorhouse cart loaded coal bought with money that had finally reached the people for whom it was collected. Diana stepped into the pale noon light on her husband's arm, bandages gone, scars visible and clean, and felt the world for once account for her exactly.